manifest means in this context, but I started playing the piano when I was in the 2nd grade. And it was really my mother who played the piano who inspired me to take lessons. So I was a young child and would watch her play the piano, and I just admired seeing those fingers going up and down the keyboard. I thought she was this great virtuoso, and it was kind of funny because later on when I started studying piano in college, I remembered the piece she played, and and I took it out of the book and I started playing it, and I realized she really butchered it. Sorry. Anyway, she was a great inspiration, and so I started taking lessons with the neighbor lady down the block, and I would drop 2 quarters in a jar. It was 50 cents a lesson. And the first book went pretty good, but then by the time I got to book 2, she started telling me that I had to count 1 and 2 and I went home crying, saying, I don't want to count. I just liked playing whatever rhythm I wanted. So then my mother realized I needed to take more professional lessons, and so she drove me all the way downtown Minneapolis from the suburbs to study at McPhail. And I studied with Mr. Langley was his name, an old Hungarian. He had hair growing out of his nose. And I would kind of fight with him too, because I always wanted to play fun stuff like Mozart Rondo alla Turca. And he said, that's too difficult for you. Your rhythm isn't any good. And so he'd make me play all these horrible Czerny exercises. And so then I'd complain to my mother and I'd say, Mom, I can't stand this. And so she'd take me to Schmidt's and I'd say, I want Rondo alla Turca by Mozart. And more than you want to know. But it just gives you a glimpse of my early years. But then she died when I was in the 7th or 8th grade. No, actually it was 9th grade. And so my lessons stopped because my father didn't believe in it, of course. But I kept playing. And I played in high school theater and the community theater. But I had bad habits and bad technique. And so it wasn't really until I started at the University of Minnesota that I took up lessons with a teaching assistant, because my first music choice was composition, not piano performance. But then as I started studying the piano, I advanced rapidly, and the TA, teaching assistant, said, you know, you really need to get with a professor. So I auditioned for Professor Bernard Weiser at the university and got accepted, and I made great progress. Started passing up my peers. About 6 years later, when I got into graduate school, I ended up being a finalist in the Schubert Club competition. But many years later, when I talked to my professor, I said, you know, why did you take me back then? Because I was so behind so many of my peers. And he said, I felt sorry for you.
Your turn's not there.
Yeah, I think maybe there is a theme. Maybe I have a little bit of control in me. But also a strong spirit. Let's put the positive on it. Well, I was accepted into Northwestern University right out of high school, and had a good scholarship there, and went there. And I really didn't have a major picked out at that time, but this was in 1970, and obviously this was the time of hippies, and everybody wanted to do what they wanted, and money didn't seem to be the driving force back then. The economy was doing really well, and so most of my friends and I did not want to pursue a career in money. So then we'd go into something that was really impractical, like English or art. And I thought I wanted to be somewhat practical, so I thought maybe I'd go into architecture. And so I started taking prerequisites in art, but at the same time math and calculus. And that was my first aspiration. But then my second year in college, I decided I didn't want to go back to Northwestern, which was a big mistake, because looking back, because I had a full room and board and tuition scholarship. If my mother had been alive, I would have stayed there. But it was hard to make friends, and the friends I made decided not to go back to Northwestern, so I decided to go back to Minnesota, and I enrolled at the University of Minnesota, still thinking that I wanted to be a serious painter. But you had to take all these prerequisites at the University of Minnesota, and finally I finished about 3 or 4 prerequisites, and I finally got into my first painting class with George Morrison. And it was a total bust because at that point, George was teaching all abstract expressionism, and I was really a romantic, and I wanted to paint like Rubens or Caravaggio. And so they would hire the model and put the model out on the floor, and I would be painting a realistic painting of the model with a little chiaroscuro thrown in. And, and everybody else in the class was doing abstract, and they all got A's, and I got a B minus. And I really felt that the professor was being prejudiced. And he even came around once and looked at my painting, and he said, "What are you trying to be, Rubens?" And so I got in a fight with him, and that was the end of art. And I just decided from that point on I was going to pursue music. And part of the reason I liked music is because it was chronological. It was taught in a chronological, historical method. In other words, you started off with the Renaissance, and then you went into the Baroque, and then you went into classic and romantic, and that fit my personality and pursuit of a career better. So my first music career goal was actually composition. And I studied with Dr. Fettler and experimented a little with composition. But as I said earlier, I really took a liking and passion to piano. And it was like I found my lost soul from my earlier childhood, and I really threw myself into it and started practicing very hard, and really made great strides. Well, actually, I'd been going up there ever since high school. I'd go up there with friends, and we would camp and hang out. So I was familiar with the area, and just in awe of it, as most people are, because it's such a beautiful area. The wilderness and the clean air and the water, the wildlife. And so I remember in high school once I went up there. Actually, I was having a hard time with some of my friends, and I decided I'm just going to go up there and gain some solitude. And so I actually hitchhiked all the way up there in high school and got up there. And this was the day when you could camp out in Big Bay State Park. No, I mean the town park. You could camp right on the water there. And again, this was 1970 or 69 hippie era. So all the hippies had their colorful tents along the beach. And I remember going up there feeling sorry for myself and trying to pitch a tent. You know, I had been a Boy Scout and all that, so I should have known, but it was raining, and I cut my finger, and one of the older hippies next door came over and felt sorry for me and said, "Why don't you join us?" And so that was a very early memory. And then also in high school, I got invited to stay at the Bristol farmhouse, which is really kind of ironic in a way, because Michael Bristol ended up becoming a longtime board member and board chair. And how I got invited was through a senior in Mounds View High School. I was a junior and she was a senior. Her name was Vicki Livingston. And it was her grandmother who had married Michael Bristol's father. And she decided that she liked me and a couple other juniors in high school, and we got invited up and stayed at the Bristol farmhouse. So when you think about it, I suppose that would have been 20 years later that I started the camp. So I mean, I had roots back to it as a vacation place, a place of enjoyment. Well, let's backtrack a little. The first idea was to just have a music camp. And I had just finished my master's degree in piano performance in probably 1984 or 85 at the University of Minnesota. And I was teaching at Schmidt Music Company, teaching piano. And I also played commercial piano through college to support myself. And one of the places I played at was the Nicollet Island Inn, which got started by a man named Alan Fischlowitz. And at that time, he bought the old Chateau Madeline on Madeline Island, and ran it as a resort. And he had a grand piano up there, and he invited me to come up and play that summer. So I was really on a lark that summer. It was between my master's and what was supposed to be my doctorate. And the doctorate program didn't work out for one reason or another, so I was looking at trying to do something different. And I was just playing commercial piano at the Chateau and also at the clubhouse, which was owned by Mary Rice at the time, and the Bayfield Inn. And I think just being away from academia and focusing, having blinders on and focusing so seriously on the piano, I started taking the blinders off and thinking, what else could I do? And I was rooming with this cook at the Chateau, and the two of us were really just, as we go to bed at night, we were just fantasizing about, wouldn't it be fun to have a camp up here, a music camp? And he was talking about the menus, and I was talking about the music. So that was the first idea to start a camp. And it was actually Alan Fischowitz, the owner of the Chateau, who had the idea of chamber music. I would not have thought of chamber music in the beginning. I was just thinking of music, and I didn't really think what genre. But he mentioned that chamber music would fit with the island because the island is small and it's small numbers of forces. And so that's how it really came about. I said, that sounds like a good idea. Starting the music camp was anything but easy. I had so many people tell me, you'll never do it, you won't succeed. People in Wisconsin in particular, they said they had a summer program for string players at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the deal was, if you went to that program as a junior in high school, you got your whole 4 years tuition, room, and board paid for at the university. So all the professors in Wisconsin said, you'll never get this started. You're competing against us. Well, I just didn't let that stop me, and I have a funny story to tell about that. So I went out recruiting at all these youth orchestras in Wisconsin, and I went to the Milwaukee Youth Symphony Orchestra, and I got in front of the group and started talking about the program. And then the next day I went to this high school that had a good string program, and I was in there in front of the high school string class talking about the Madeline Island Music Camp, which was maybe 1 or 2 years old at that time. And all of a sudden the phone rang in the back of the classroom, and one of the students went in to get it, and he said, Mr. George, there's a phone call for you. And I thought, here I am in this high school in a Milwaukee suburb, who would know me? And I get into the room and take the phone, and here it is, the director of the Milwaukee Youth Symphony Orchestra, and he says, I told you not to recruit in this town, you hungry dog recruiter. So to answer your question, no, it was not easy. There were so many hurdles, and there were so many other programs. Nobody knew what Madeline Island Music Camp was. Yes, many years later, where we are now today, the idea of coming to Madeline Island as a beautiful spot, it's still not an easy sell. It still takes work to recruit. You have to market and you have to advertise. But I think what's always gone for us has made us, one aspect that's made us successful is that it's easy to convince the faculty to come back, because once you've hired the faculty and they come to this beautiful paradise, they want to be invited back again. So for that reason, Madeline Island is very attractive.
So,
okay. No, it had a lot of hiccups, a lot of hurdles, a lot of problems in the early days. I mean, I'm a classic entrepreneur. I had the passion and the energy, but I really didn't know what I was doing. I learned as I went along. What's the old saying? Fake it until you make it. I can tell you the first year, if everything could go, anything could go wrong, everything did go wrong. I mean, the bus broke down, kids were stranded from where they were staying, from the cafeteria, and counselors were bad counselors with the students. I won't mention what went on, but just every little problem. In fact, I was fired the first year by Alan Fischowitz from what he called at the time Madeline Island Performing Arts Center. So if that gives you an answer about things that can go wrong. But then each year after, incrementally things did improve, but there were still so many issues. I remember in all the student evaluation, it was always so, well, the schedule was so confusing, and everything was chaotic, and And it's because I had a very small staff, a very small budget, and so I ended up doing everything. It was just completely exhausting. But little by little, you know, as we started to raise more money and were able to hire a little bit more staff, and I figured out how to do things more smoothly, it did get easier. But I'm telling you, if I had to do it over again, I think I might question my sanity.
So really there were, right?
When I was fired from the first program in 1985, I just assumed it was all over. I went to my attorney and he said, you know, there's nothing you can do. You're hired by the corporation. And so I just left and said, here's the keys and here's the bank account. And that was it. Of course, it was very depressing. I really had poured my heart and soul into that first venture. And it wasn't until Mary Rice picked up the phone about 6 months later and she says, I hear you got fired. And she said, I never cared for Alan Fischowitz. And she says, why don't you come up and we'll start a new corporation? She said, because I know you were the guy that really was the reason this thing happened, and I like it. So it wasn't just me, it was Mary. And Mary was the money in the first year and the money for the first 10 years. She really was our founding benefactor.
Were there others?
Well, not as big as Mary. I mean, Mary, when she backed the new corporation called Mandolin Island Music Camp in 1986, she said, I'll be a third of the budget. So I had to raise the rest of that budget from tuition and from fundraising. And we had a board of directors, but in the early days it wasn't as strong as, nearly as strong as it is now. It took a long time before the board developed into a board that really became a giving board. I think people had the feeling that, oh, Mary would take care of it, and so it was harder to get major gifts. But we did some successful fundraising up there. People liked the idea of the camp, and they came to the clubhouse for dinner concerts, which were very successful. And yes, there were other individuals who gave gifts, but they were not at the level that she was giving.
Okay, I'm going to stop for just start that one over.
Okay. The island has a real atmosphere for learning, and the reason is when you leave the mainland and get on that boat, you leave all your cares and worries behind, and you come to this magical place where there's very little to distract you except for the beautiful nature which inspires you. So that's what we always say. It's a great place to go. You don't have any distractions. And the way we've developed our camp and our facilities, there's very little transportation that's involved, and that's what makes this really successful. I mean, I always joke that the kids roll out of bed and roll down the hill to their practice room, whereas trying to put a string quartet together for high school kids or even college kids, it's very complicated. They all have their schedules and their life. They have to have their parents transport them to places, so you can't get nearly as much time in, and there's too many distractions. So that's how I sell the island for chamber music. Well, for one thing, the string quartet is different than orchestral, solo, and other genres in that we always say it's one to a part. In other words, there's 4 voices, violin, 2 violins, viola, and cello, and they each have their own part. So that's one thing to distinguish it from other genres. And I always say, or I've always said to students and parents, that I think it's the most rigorous and challenging art form for musicians, and therefore it develops them at a much more rapid rate. Being one to a part, there's no faking it. I mean, if you're in a string player or a violin player in the orchestra, depending on the size of the orchestra, you might be there with 20 other violins. So if you didn't practice that week, you might be able to kind of fake it. Well, there's no such thing in the string quartet. Each of your colleagues is dependent on you to know your part and to play it, and the rhythm has to be exact and precise. That's really one big thing that distinguishes the string quartet from the other musical art forms.
You know, the full orchestra is kind of...
Well, I think when you listen to some of the string quartet pieces that have been written over the ages, you will experience subtlety that you really don't in the orchestral experience. I mean, a really good orchestra like the Minnesota Orchestra under the baton of Osmo Venska can really get a beautiful pianissimo, but I doubt that it's as soft as what a string quartet can achieve. So in that regard, yes. And because it's so spare, there's an economy of means, you hear the voices so much more clearly, the inner voices, and it's just a wonderful art form.
Apparently some of the greatest composers agreed with you because on string quartets.
It's true. I mean, Haydn was what we call the father or the grandfather of the string quartet, and then Mozart followed, and then the art form really reached a pinnacle in Beethoven. And after that, we have composers all the way into the 20th century, 21st century that continue to compose for that art form.
What do you think?
Well, I think there's a challenge to composing for a string quartet because of the limited voices that you're dealing with. I mean, it'd be like giving a painter 4 colors and only 4 colors to paint the canvas with, and so thus it becomes more challenging to create colorations, and it's just the true essence of music. The camp really does matter to the students who participated, and I know that because I talk to alums 20 years later, and they talk about the camp and the lifelong friendships that they form up there. And now, of course, with social media, we have access to those alums, and every week some new alum will like us, whether they're 20, 30, 40, or probably the oldest alum would be in their 40s at this point. But there are people that have been constant, like Mary Rice, for example. She was a funder from day one, and she still is a funder. We have board member Kathy Score, who's on the board, who was on the board in 1985 and 86. She took some time off. So to say that I'm the only constant isn't really true, but I am a constant. I've been here for 30 years with no breaks. Well, it's just been a joy. I mean, I have given my whole life to running the Madeline Island Music Camp, and I decided early on that I didn't want to become a piano professor, or I didn't want to do something else. I really wanted to be an entrepreneur, and one of the things that keeps me going is challenge. As an entrepreneur, I love new things. Once I get something down and tend to master it, then I get a little bit bored, and I like to delegate it to somebody on the staff or the team. But if there's a new project coming ahead, that's what keeps me going. Well, one thing about my personality is I see things where there isn't anything. For example, I've restored 2 historic brownstones in the Whittier neighborhood in Minneapolis, and they were complete wrecks, but I saw that 40 years ago that these could become beautiful, whereas other people would come in and just say, walk away. I think it was the same thing with the music camp. I went up there, and of course it was a beautiful natural area, but there was no buildings, no practice rooms, no facilities, but I could see a vision of that in the future, and so that, keeps me going. For example, the building program was really an inspiring part of the 30-year history. That was very energizing for me. Well, the faculty, that has evolved somewhat over the years. It's very important now that we have faculty that have a class of students that they can recruit to the camp. We have 2 major types at the camp. One type would fit into those that are part of a professional string quartet or chamber music ensemble, and the other are maybe more like distinguished professors at universities and conservatories. But they also probably have had extensive chamber music experience in their career, but they're not exclusively devoted to it, as are some of the performers. The faculty at Madeline Island Music Camp are really some of the most gifted and talented people in the country, even in the world. For example, our new artistic director, Jonathan Swartz, has hired fantastic string quartets for this year, but in 2016 he's got an incredible lineup. For example, it includes, this year we have the American String Quartet, who've been around for many years, who teach at the Manhattan School of Music. We have the Dover String Quartet that's coming next year from, they're the string quartet in residence at Curtis. And they're actually a young group that came out of Rice University in Texas. They studied in the graduate program there as the young professional string quartet in residence. And they were such a hot group, they got picked up right away by Curtis. And so we're hiring them for 2016. We have the Brentano, who came years ago, who have a stellar reputation. They perform in New York and at the Lincoln Center. And so the camp really has always had just the top talent in the country.
One thing
Well, recruiting has also evolved over the years, but in the very early years we used to audition only in Minneapolis and in Wisconsin, but it became very clear soon on that we'd have to expand our geographic recruiting area. Because a lot of these youth orchestras where some of the students come from in the high school would go on European tours, and so then we'd lose that whole group of students for recruiting. But now, many years later, we've expanded into the college age and even graduate level, and we've really developed pipelines around the country. For example, we've had a long relationship and history with students from Texas, in particular Houston, and Rice, the Shepherd School of Music down there. And we've gotten to know these professors. They send their students there. The students come back every year, and they just, they say how much they love it. I've had parents call us up after one of their children has come to camp and say, "What did you do to them? They never stop practicing." So it's a pipeline. You build a reputation, and people know how good you are, and so then they continue to send students. So we have pipelines, Houston, we have pipelines in the Carolinas, Madison, and now even Canada, and quite a few places in the country. So we focus on our strengths, and it's also done, the artistic director strategically hires faculty throughout the country who can help bring us students. Well, I think a major milestone was our building program. About 10 years into the camp, it became clear that this was a going concern, but we couldn't continue relying on renting facilities, because what would happen if all of a sudden the place where we'd feed the kids would no longer rent to us? We'd be out of business. It was actually an early board chairman who convinced me to get serious about the building program. I hadn't given it a huge amount of thought, and I thought, well, that would be really fun and a challenge. So I would say 10 years into the camp, that became a real milestone. We started small. Trying to find a location on the island was very difficult. I mean, you would think, oh, we'll just buy some land and build. Well, that was not the case. We ended up having many battles with the town of La Pointe trying to get a conditional use permit on the island. So we'd hire an architect to do a sketch of a drawing, and we went through 5 different locations on the island to try to convince the town of La Pointe to give us a conditional use permit. And there was always a lot of not in my backyard from neighbors, and of course I was a young man at that point, and I was really innocent to all these things. Now when I look back at it, I realize how foolish to try to start a camp on Nebraska Road with all those neighbors who've been coming up there for 4 generations. If I had been a neighbor, I would have fought it too, but at the point I was just thinking about the camp and myself. And finally we did find a location on the island. It's actually close to town. The students can walk to town. And it was actually Bob Hartzell, who owns the inn on Madeline Island, who encouraged us to buy this land not far from his resort, actually. And he even offered to pay for, he gave us $50,000 a lead gift to build a sewer extension to the camp, because one of the things we thought very wisely early on was we didn't want a holding tank with 48 high school students. We'd be having the sewer pumped out every week, and the Honey Dipper would be holding us hostage. Next. Another milestone was building the major donor base. I spoke earlier about Mary Rice being our founding angel, but when we started the building program and got serious about it, we were able to recruit a couple board members who had capacity to give more money. One of them was Michael Bristol, and the other was Tom Rogers, who just happened on the scene one year when things were actually very financially tight, and said that his mother was really attracted to the Madeline Island Music Camp, and she had started a charitable remainder trust, and she wanted to fund us in a major way. It was one of those shocking things that, you know, I had to pinch myself and say, is this really true? But it turned out it was true. Tom Rogers was the son of Virginia Townley. She spent the summers at the Brule, and we had been doing tour concerts to the Brule every couple of years, and we did a big event at the Ordways compound on Cedar Island, and she had come in 1992, and she heard the camp, and every year she'd write a little check for $100 and a nice note around Christmas time, and said how she loved the camp, and she especially loved our logo. And it was about 5 or 6 years later that her son showed up on the island saying that his mother wanted to fund us in a significant way. So talk about milestone. That was very huge, because she started making very generous gifts. The first one was $15,000, but the peak reached over $200,000 a year. So that allowed us really to grow both programmatically and to build the capital infrastructure of our buildings and facilities. So that was a very, very big milestone. But another really huge milestone, of course, was our 25th anniversary. That just happened in 2010, 5 years ago. And it was a real turning point for the camp, because as we know, that was during the Great Recession, and yet we had in the works a plan to do a orchestra comprised of faculty and our top students and alumni, and we were very fortunate to get Osmo Venska to come up and conduct. And so we had started that planning in 2008 before the Great Recession hit, and we were so far into the planning that we weren't going to pull the plug on it. And it was very interesting because people stopped spending and giving money in 2009, but when we came up with this exciting program for 2010, people came forward and were very generous. I am so grateful for the planning for that event, because it shows you when times are tough, if you've got something exciting going, people are going to back you. They're going to come behind you. There were many other arts organizations who retrenched, and it was the worst thing they could do. So we did it, we got great support, and all of a sudden our visibility became so much greater. The whole program became viral. The idea of having Osmo Venska, a great conductor, conducting under a tent on Madeline Island captured the interest of reporters and writers, and it just went viral. And so all of a sudden we were on the map. And since 2010, we've been able to enlarge our program to include an advanced and fellowship program. And that has been a huge milestone. The last 5 years has been very satisfying because of the our fellowship program, where we fully fund students. We raise money to create a named fellowship, and it's just brought the level of the camp that much higher. This is not to ignore our younger students who form the core of our curriculum, and what we founded the camp for, was younger students. But now we've got a continuum from, we have a student coming who is age 13 this year and all the way to age 24. And those young students see the idea of coming in the future, and they look forward to it, and we build in our own pipeline for future attendees.
Okay, I'm going to...
We've been extremely fortunate with the board leadership that we've had over the last 30 years. And each board chairman has brought a different gift to the organization, which was appropriate to the time in our history. For example, I look back at Yvonne Foster, who was an early serving board member, probably in the 90s. And we used to joke about Yvonne that she had the velvet glove. She wore this velvet glove because up to this point, we could not get a conditional use permit from the town of La Pointe. And we went through 4 sites. And so finally we were on this 5th site, the one I mentioned before that it was close to town. And we recruited Yvonne Foster to become our chair because we knew she had that velvet glove, that velvet touch. And it was mostly men that served on the La Pointe zoning board. There was, I think, 1 woman at the time. But she had that soft touch that she could go to the chairman and the people, and she's the one that got it for us. So when you talk about board chair, I always look back at, what did they do for us? So Yvonne is just one example, but each one of them had huge contributions. Michael Bristol became chair and served for 5 years, and he really helped with funding at the time. He had the capacity. He issued several challenge grants that propelled us forward on our capital campaign. Tom Rogers, who I mentioned, Virginia Townley's son, he was very important in that he brought the funding in from his mother, and when his mother died, he ensured that we received a $2 million bequest that just happened in 2013, which allowed us to pay off all of our mortgage debt and began the beginnings of an endowment. And then we had Caroline Marshall, who's been serving for the last 5 years, and she's been remarkable in terms of her planning skills and her experience with the broader artistic landscape. She was a professional consultant with Wolf Brown in Washington, D.C., and she brought a perspective that has really brought us forward. I remember at one of the early planning meetings, she kept on talking about the Rising Stars program at Carramore. And I was going, huh? All I could think about was recruiting high school kids to the camp, and I probably would still be doing that to this day if it hadn't been for Caroline and her vision. She brought me out of the day-to-day weeds, so to speak, to look at the larger vision, and it's been really a joy to work with her. But every chairman, I don't want to leave anyone out. Fred Hutchinson, way back when, he was the one that introduced the idea of building facilities. And there was Nancy Johnson, who came from Wisconsin, who was a business executive and who ran the smoothest meeting I can ever remember. So when you talk about the chairman, it's just been my joy and pleasure to work with the chairs. And the chair and the executive director have to be so tight and work together. And I think I've been blessed with really great people. There are odd assortment of people in Madeline Island. I think the island itself attracts people that are free-spirited and independent, and I'm one of them. Everyone that comes to Madeline Island has stars in their eyes, and they have a vision of how things should be. And some of those independent spirits have clashed with the vision of Madeline Island Music Camp, I have to be honest. I mean, we had quite a few disputes with people along the way, especially when we were trying to get our zoning. I'll never forget, it was the tax assessor, I won't name his name, but he was totally against development on Madeline Island. And the rumor I heard was he came from Aspen, when Aspen was just a little small cowboy town. And then, of course, all the millionaires and now billionaires have moved in, and he didn't want to see that happening to Madeline Island. And the idea of introducing chamber music to Madeline Island, which most of the people love country music or pop or rock, and chamber music is foreign to a lot of people on the island. So when you don't know something, it becomes threatening. So he fought us very vigorously, and I'll never forget, he wrote the Bristols a letter calling them, instead of Dear Edie and Michael, it was Dear Mr. and Mrs. Culture, being very sarcastic. So that was just an example of one of the letters that was written. And we've had many other instances in trying to get a conditional use permit where people would do crazy things. The tax assessor even wrote a letter to me once, a cease and desist letter. He went out and reserved the name Mandolin Island Music Camp Inc., which we don't have an Inc. after it, but he reserved it and then sent us a cease and desist letter. So there were a lot of problems. And it was very difficult, I mean, to persevere. And you had asked me earlier why I persevered all these years, and I have to say, it's because of the great support from the board of directors. These people are smart, and they've been around, and they would just say, you know, come on, let's just pursue this angle or pursue that angle. And so it was that kind of support that kept me going. But now, looking back at it, now that I'm much older and much wiser, I can see why they did fight and resist the Mandolin Island Music Camp. We were the first really outside organization to get a use permit on the island, and I'm grateful every day for what the year-round people do for Mandolin Island Music Camp. They're the ones that take care of the infrastructure, the roads. They get you over there. You know, these people are really important people, and we've come together to enjoy each other now. And I also see what drove them in their resistance. They went to Mandolin Island because they wanted the peace and isolation and the beauty. And those qualities are exactly what the Mandolin Island Music Camp flourishes on, the peace and the quiet and the beauty. That's what makes it so successful. So now, looking back on it, I'm grateful to those folks for fighting so hard. I agree with them. But we're very lucky to be part of that community.
So,
with the board of directors and with the faculty, I think my success has been that I've always hired people that are at a higher level than I am in certain areas of expertise. I mean, I was a young man and didn't have nearly the experience that the principal players of the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra had when I hired them to teach in that very first year. The same with the board of directors. If you're going to do something serious, you really need quality people that have a variety of skills. Of course, having board members with capacity is really important, but it's not the only thing. These days we have quite a varied board, and what's really fun about the board is when I started, I was a young man in my 30s, and the board members were in their 50s and 60s. And now I'm in my 60s, and I'm starting to recruit board members in their 40s, and we even had a board member in their 20s, and it's really fun now for me to, you know, wear the other shoe. I'm the older person, and I've got younger talent on the board, and some of these younger folks, they don't have the capacity to write a big check, but they have incredible professional expertise. For example, Alex Hecker's on our board now, and his father was the architect who designed our facilities, and Alex is also an architect, so he's giving us pro bono architectural services. So it's a varied board, and they've got a lot of different talents. And it isn't a rubber stamp board, but for the most part, it's been a harmonious organization. It's not the kind of situation that you see in some arts organization where there's a lot of strife. We've been able to get along and throughout our history. Well, one of the changes I've seen over the 30 years is the interest in chamber music has grown so exponentially. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. But one is that young musicians realize that not all of them are going to get that plum orchestra job. And in fact, the orchestra jobs, as we've seen, are maybe not so plum anymore. You've got situations where people won't hire you full-time and you don't get the benefits. They're hiring a lot of substitute players. And so young musicians are being encouraged to become more entrepreneurial, and chamber music fits that spirit of becoming an entrepreneur. When I started the camp, there were just a handful of summer programs that were comparable to us in terms of just purely focusing on chamber music. Now, there are many, many programs across the country. I'll never forget going to New York for Chamber Music America, and this is about 10 years into the program, and I had brought our development assistant at the time to New York so we could both partake in the conference, and this woman recognized, his name was, I forget, Doug Capecci, I think, and she came up to Doug and she said, she saw his name tag for Madeline Music Camp, and she said, "Oh, I really admire that program of yours. We're going to start one in California that's just like it." And I was kind of like taken aback. It's like, well, why don't you say that to me? I'm the founder. But no, it was a great compliment to have another program in the country admire what we were doing and emulate it. Of course, that creates more competition, but it further fosters the art form of chamber music. Another thing I've seen that's changed, programs that I thought that were great competitors to Madeline Music Camp, who I never thought would ever disappear, have. For example, there was the Encore string program in Cleveland. All of the faculty at the Cleveland Institute, one of the top conservatories in the country, would take their students to this program called Encore, and it was a 6-week program, and it happened at the same time Madeline Music Camp did, and it was really a practice camp. The students would just sit in a practice room for 5 hours and practice. But every year I would lose students to Encore. No, we're sending them to Encore. Well, then all of a sudden, I can't remember, maybe it was about 10 years ago, Encore, Cleveland decided to quit that. Other programs have gone out of business. For example, there was Music Corda, which again was a very well-known and strong program, and we competed for students to that program, and one year they went out of business. So new camps start, others go out of business. So it's a changing music world.
So entrepreneurial, this kind of help them understand that fact.
Well, one of the programs that we've initiated in the last 5 years is training the young entrepreneurs how to become entrepreneurs. We brought up Angela Miles Beeching last year, who is a professional career development professor from, I think she was at Eastman for a while, and she's written a book called Beyond Talent. In other words, saying talent isn't enough, you also have to have business skills if you're going to try to make it as a string quartet. It's not easy. I mean, not only do you have to become one of the best musicians that you can be and then form an ensemble, but then you also have to market yourself. You have to be a business person. You have to find ways to reach new audiences. You have to play in unusual venues. We've started this artist residency program, and last fall we brought up the Cordova String Quartet. We invited them to Minneapolis in the fall. They had attended Madeline Music Camp in the summer of 2014. And we presented them at the Ice House Studio, which mostly presents jazz and electric string instrument, guitars, not string quartets. But we thought this would be a way for the Cordova to get an experience with a different kind of audience, and also to build new audiences. And it was really a great performance. People came up afterward and congratulated the musicians, and some of these people at the Ice House, this might have been the first time ever that they've heard string quartet. So we continue to develop that aspect of our program through the artist residencies that we provide in the fall and the spring, giving a variety of professional experiences to help these young musicians maybe find a path toward a career.
All right, is there anything I missed?